Welcome to today's story time. In this episode, we dive into a gripping tale of love, betrayal, and the cost of freedom. Ethan and Phoenix, a seemingly perfect couple, are about to face the ultimate test in their marriage. While Ethan pours himself into his career, Phoenix struggles with feelings of loneliness, leading her down a dangerous path. What happens when hidden desires come to light, and the truth is far more complex than it seems? Stay tuned as we unravel the twists and turns in this emotionally charged drama. Ethan came home that afternoon, finally free for a few hours after finishing a huge project. He hadn't seen his wife in days, and he had to admit he missed her quite a bit. The moment he stepped inside, he went straight for Phoenix, eager for her touch. She pushed him away, annoyed. "Why don't you just stay gone?" she snapped. "Honey, I'm sorry," Ethan said, pulling her close. "Let me make it up to you. How about some fun? By the way, where's Mrs. Willow? I gave her the day off. I wasn't sure what I wanted to eat, so she didn't need to be here." Perfect timing, then. Ethan grinned. "I think I need a shower first." "Right, go ahead." Phoenix's voice softened, a playful smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't often she saw him this eager, and it was turning her on. "Actually," she purred, "why don't I join you?" Ethan practically dragged her towards the bathroom, and they spent the next hour lost in a haze of pleasure. When they finally emerged, breathless and sated, Ethan wore a look of blissful contentment. Phoenix, however, couldn't have looked more different. She lay sprawled on the bed, her silk nightgown doing little to conceal her stunning figure. She tossed and turned, unable to sleep despite the cool air conditioning blasting through the room. A restless heat burned inside her, a fire that refused to be quenched. Annoyed, she threw off the covers and paced around the room, the feeling of frustration growing unbearable. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been able to fall asleep easily. At 30, Phoenix was still a vision, her beauty undeniable. Her slender figure, with its captivating curves, drew admiring glances wherever she went. It didn't matter that she was married, men in town still turned their heads when she passed by. She moved with a confident grace, stepping out of her sleek car and heading into their home. It had been 3 years since she and Ethan had married. He was a successful contractor, always on the go, working long hours to build their life together. They had decided to live on their own, away from the constraints of living with his parents. They had a beautiful villa in a nearby town, lacking nothing except, perhaps, a child. Ethan was a decade older than her, already established and successful when they met. He had been captivated by her beauty, her seductive gaze drawing him in. After a whirlwind courtship, he was determined to make her his wife, despite whispers in town about her sharp tongue and even sharper ambition. But Ethan had been sure of his choice, believing that their love could weather any storm. He had envisioned a future filled with shared dreams and quiet contentment. He worked tirelessly, pouring all his energy into his career. He wanted to give Phoenix everything: designer clothes, sparkling jewelry, a life of luxury. He wanted her to have more than anyone else. But what Ethan didn't realize was that material possessions, while they might have brought a fleeting sense of satisfaction, couldn't fill the void in Phoenix's heart. Their love life had been sporadic from the very beginning, dwindling even further as Ethan became consumed by his work. How could a young woman in her prime be expected to endure such neglect? Still, she tried, for love, for him, for the comfortable life he provided. But every night was a battle against her own desires. She knew that she could have any man she wanted, that a simple nod from her would have them lining up at her door. And tonight was no different. Except for one thing. Every night, Phoenix wrestled with her own desires. She knew that with a single nod, she could have 100 men at her feet, vying for her attention, desperate to fulfill her every whim. And tonight was no different. Except, the image of Drake, Mrs. Willow's young son, kept flashing in her mind. His quiet strength as he moved furniture that afternoon, the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders. She had let her touch linger a little too long, her voice dropping to a suggestive whisper. The memory sent a wave of heat through her, a mixture of guilt and anticipation. Mrs. Willow finished her chores and approached Phoenix with a tired smile. "Well, Phoenix, all done here. I'm heading home now," she announced. Mrs. Willow worked part-time for them, coming in a few days a week to help with the cooking and cleaning. Usually, she arrived around 10 in the morning and left by 5. But today, with all the construction dust from the neighbor's demolition, she had stayed later. Phoenix stepped inside and pulled out her wallet, fishing out a crisp $50 note. "You've been working so hard, Mrs. Willow. Please, take this and treat yourself to something nice," she insisted, pressing the money into the older woman's hand. "And please thank Drake again for his help." "Oh, it was nothing at all." Mrs. Willow chuckled. "The boy just finished his exams. He's got plenty of free time on his hands. Anything you need, just give me a call, and I'll send him over." "Don't be silly. Take it." "Well, thank you, Phoenix. You're too kind. All right then, I'm off." Mrs. Willow bustled out, a contented smile on her face. It was an easy enough job. Really, Ethan and Phoenix were both relatively tidy, and she enjoyed the quiet solitude of their home. Besides, they treated her well, always slipping her a little extra for her troubles. Where else would she find such an ideal arrangement? Drake, honey, come on, let's go," she called out, noticing her son loitering by the gate. He was staring intently at something, and when she followed his gaze, she saw Phoenix standing on the porch, her figure illuminated by the warm glow of the porch light. "What are you staring at, boy? Don't be creepy," she hissed, swatting his arm playfully. "Come on, let's get out of here." Drake didn't reply, lost in the sight of Phoenix. He had seen her around before, of course, and each time, he found himself drawn to her. He usually waited for his mother outside, catching glimpses of her as she moved through the house. Mrs. Willow, noticing his blatant stare, gave him another nudge. "Earth to Drake, what's gotten into you? I said, let's go." He jumped, startled. "Huh? Yeah, okay, Mom, coming," he mumbled, scrambling onto his motorbike. "Honestly, what were you staring at? And don't you dare get any funny ideas," his mother scolded as he revved the engine. "Nothing, Mom, just admiring the architecture. Nice house," he replied, hoping she didn't notice his flushed cheeks. It wasn't the first time Drake had seen Phoenix, and it certainly wasn't the first time he had felt a stirring in his loins at the sight of her. At 18, he was at that age where his hormones were in overdrive, and the forbidden allure of the beautiful older woman was almost impossible to resist. This time, it was different. He wasn't content to just fantasize about Phoenix, he wanted something more. Her suggestive words from earlier echoed in his mind, urging him forward. "So, Drake?" Phoenix had asked him, her voice a husky whisper. "How old are you now? You're looking very strong and capable these days." Drake had stumbled over his words. I just turned 18, ma'am." Phoenix had laughed, a throaty, suggestive sound. 18, you say? Well, they do say that men your age can move mountains." Drake hadn't known what to say to that, so he had just offered a nervous chuckle. Now, as he steered his bike towards home, Phoenix's words echoed in his mind, making his blood run hot. I need to swing by my friend's place for a bit. I'll be back a little later. Mom, don't lock the gate," he called out, already halfway down the street. Mrs. Willow shook her head, watching her son speed away. She knew exactly what, or rather who, had caught his eye back there. She'd seen the way he looked at Phoenix, the way his gaze lingered on her. But boys will be boys, she thought. It's only natural for him to be attracted to beautiful women. Drake was a good boy at heart. He had been through a lot, losing his father at such a young age. But he had turned out all right. He was responsible, independent, and she trusted him to make good choices. Drake parked his motorbike a few houses down from the Hawthorne residence. He couldn't very well leave it out in the open. It wouldn't take a genius to figure out who was sneaking around. He'd just leave it at his friend's for a while and come back for it later. His heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and fear as he approached the villa. Inside, Phoenix was still restless. She had tried to sleep, but it was no use. Ethan's touch, while welcome, had only stoked the flames of her desire, leaving her feeling emptier than ever. She tossed and turned, the silk sheets clinging to her heated skin. The roar of a motorbike engine cut through the stillness, making her sit up abruptly. She hadn't heard Ethan's car. He must still be out with his buddies. Annoyed, she pushed back the covers and went to the window. Her eyes darted to the street, searching for the source of the noise. That's when she saw him. Drake. He stood at the edge of their property, his gaze fixed on her window. Even in the dim light, she could see the hunger in his eyes. It mirrored her own. Her nightgown, barely there to begin with, billowed softly in the breeze, revealing tantalizing glimpses of her body. Phoenix felt a thrill course through her as she met his gaze. She knew she should tell him to leave, to forget this ever happened. But her body, her heart, craved something more. Ethan wasn't coming home tonight. She knew it with a certainty that sent a shiver down her spine. Phoenix turned away from the window and walked back to the bedroom. Leaving the front door unlocked, she lay down on the bed, one hand resting on her forehead, and waited. A dark figure vaulted over the wall, creeping towards the house. Drake gritted his teeth, trying to move quickly but silently. He knew Phoenix wasn't fond of dogs, and the only other inhabitants of the house were a couple of lazy cats, useless as watchdogs. It didn't take him long to find his way to Phoenix's bedroom. He seemed to have memorized the layout of the house. The dim glow of the bedside lamp illuminated her figure as she lay sprawled on the bed. And Drake felt a surge of desire course through him. He was here for one reason only, to see her. Holding his breath, Drake eased the bedroom door open and slipped inside. He tiptoed towards the bed, each step excruciatingly slow and deliberate. But when he reached the edge of the mattress, his heart lurched. Phoenix was gone. He scanned the room frantically, but she was nowhere to be found. Panic welled up inside him. Had he been wrong? Was she still angry with him for earlier? Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows near the door, bathed in a blinding light. "You're a brave one, aren't you?" Phoenix's voice was a low purr. "Sneaking in here like this." For a moment, Drake couldn't speak. He stood frozen, his blood turning to ice. Phoenix stood there, arms crossed, her eyes boring into him. Shame washed over him. He felt exposed, like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. I. He stammered, his voice cracking. "What were you hoping for, Drake?" Phoenix took a step closer, her voice a husky whisper. "You know I could have you arrested for this. Breaking and entering." I'm sorry," he blurted out. I didn't mean to steal anything. I swear, You just, what?" Phoenix raised an eyebrow, a playful smile dancing on her lips. And then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. "You know, your mother does excellent work for us," she said, her voice laced with ice. It would be a shame if she were to lose her job because of her son's indiscretions. Drake's blood ran cold. He couldn't bear the thought of his mother losing her job because of him. "Phoenix, please," he choked out. "Don't tell my mother. Please don't fire her. I'll do anything." "Anything?" Phoenix's voice was soft, dangerous. "You really think you can sneak into a woman's house in the middle of the night? And there won't be consequences?" I. Drake was speechless. His heart pounded against his ribs, his body trembling with a strange combination of fear and excitement. Had she really meant those suggestive words she'd said to him earlier? Or had he just imagined it all? "Relax, Drake." Phoenix sighed, her voice softening. "Come here." She walked over to the bed and sat down, crossing her legs, the silk of her nightgown sliding invitingly up her thighs. "Come on," she purred, her eyes locked on his. "Come over here." Drake felt like a puppet on a string, drawn towards her by an invisible force. He hadn't realized until that moment just how much he desired her. How the thought of her had consumed his every waking moment. He took a hesitant step towards her, his throat dry, his palms sweating. "If you make me happy tonight," Phoenix said, her voice barely a whisper, "perhaps we can forget this ever happened." It didn't take a genius to figure out what she wanted. Phoenix had already deleted all the footage from the security cameras. No one would ever know he was here. He moved towards her, his fear giving way to a thrilling sense of anticipation. He had been right. She wanted him just as much as he wanted her. Drake had spent his life watching other people get what they wanted. Had spent his nights fantasizing about a woman like Phoenix. But tonight, it seemed, luck was on his side. He reached the bed and stood there for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her body, drinking in the sight of her. He could sense her impatience growing. "Well?" she asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. "Don't tell me you've changed your mind." Phoenix was used to getting what she wanted, and she had a feeling that young Drake was about to give it to her. She had seen the hunger in his eyes, the way his gaze lingered on her body whenever he thought she wasn't looking. She had felt the heat radiating from him during their brief encounter earlier. And at Drake was young, virile, and completely enamored with her. And Phoenix, for all her carefully constructed control, was powerless to resist the allure of his desire. She wanted to feel his touch, to lose herself in the heat of his youthful passion. She wanted to forget, for just one night, the emptiness that had become her marriage bed. She watched as he finally took a step closer, and a slow smile spread across her lips. The game was on. Phoenix let Drake's hands wander over her body, the initial tickle of his touch giving way to a deep, satisfying heat. He had been surprisingly attentive when he massaged her shoulders or kneaded the tension from her calves. His touch both strong and gentle. But this was different. Her skin tingled under his touch, the silk of her nightgown doing little to shield her from the intensity of his gaze. It was impossible to ignore the effect she had on him. His hands, though hesitant at first, grew bolder, his touch more insistent. The desire radiating from him was almost a tangible thing, fueling her own need, pushing her closer to the edge. She couldn't hold back any longer. Phoenix surged up, pulling him down with her. They clung to each other, their bodies a tangled mess of limbs and lips and desperate need. Drake was inexperienced, his only knowledge gleaned from stolen glances at late-night movies. But he was eager to please, his youthful enthusiasm making up for his lack of finesse. "Sorry, he mumbled against her skin, his breath hot and ragged. "It's okay," she breathed, her fingers tangling in his hair. "Is this your first time?" He nodded, his cheeks flushed. "Don't worry," she whispered, her voice thick with desire. "I'll teach you." And she did. Phoenix took control, guiding him with a practiced ease that sent shivers down his spine. Their bodies moved together, a symphony of need and pleasure, until they were both lost in a haze of pure, unadulterated bliss. Drake had never felt anything like it. The intensity of her touch, the way she responded to his every move, the sheer, intoxicating pleasure, it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He returned home before dawn, his body exhausted but his senses alight. He stumbled through the door, collapsing onto his bed without bothering to undress. He could still feel the ghost of her touch on his skin, the scent of her perfume lingering in his nostrils. Mrs. Willow found him like that later that morning, sound asleep, a tired smile on his face. She'd meant to give him an earful for staying out all night. But seeing him like this, she couldn't bring herself to be angry. Phoenix had called earlier, telling her she didn't need to come in that day. She figured it was just as well, she could use a day to relax. She made breakfast and left it on the table for Drake, figuring he'd wake up starving. "Drake, breakfast's ready. Where were you last night anyway? Out painting the town red with your friends?" she called out, shaking her head in amusement. He mumbled something about staying at his friend's, playing video games until late, and then falling asleep. He looked completely drained, but there was a different kind of exhaustion in his eyes now. A satisfied weariness that she couldn't quite place. "You must have had fun," she said, raising an eyebrow as she noticed the way his hand instinctively went to his pocket. He looked away, his cheeks flushing crimson. "Just eat your breakfast, Drake, and don't forget, I need you to help me with the groceries later." Drake nodded silently, stuffing a piece of toast into his mouth. He noticed the thick wad of bills in his pocket, crisp new polymer notes that hadn't been there before. His heart skipped a beat as he realized where they must have come from. A generous tip from Phoenix. Perhaps? He thought to himself, a slow smile spreading across his face. He leaned back in his chair, his eyelids already starting to droop. Definitely worth the exhaustion. Ethan came home that afternoon after being away for days. A rare break after finishing a major project. He had missed Phoenix terribly. And the moment he saw her, he pulled her close for a passionate kiss. She pushed him away, her voice laced with irritation. Honestly, Ethan, you were gone for a week. I'd almost forgotten what you looked like, she said, though there was a playful glint in her eyes. I'm sorry, sweetheart, he said, pulling her close again. Let me make it up to you. He lowered his voice to a suggestive murmur. How about some fun? Where's Mrs. Willow, anyway? I gave her the day off. Besides, she added with a wink, I'm not sure she'd appreciate the show. Ethan chuckled. Good point. In that case, I'm going to grab a quick shower. Don't hog all the hot water. Phoenix purred, a slow smile spreading across her face. It wasn't often Ethan came home this eager. It had been a while. And she had to admit, she was enjoying his attention. Why don't you join me? He suggested, his eyes twinkling. An hour later, they emerged from the bathroom, both breathless and satisfied. For the first time in months, Phoenix felt a genuine spark of desire for her husband. He had been strong, passionate, almost primal in his need for her. They spent the rest of the afternoon wrapped in each other's arms, the passion lingering between them like smoke. But as the evening wore on, a familiar restlessness crept in. Despite Ethan's best efforts, Phoenix couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Their lovemaking, while physically satisfying, had done little to quell the insatiable hunger that burned inside her. The emptiness she had been trying to ignore for months threatened to swallow her whole. Ethan, exhausted from his trip and the afternoon's exertions, had resorted to taking a sleep aid, the one he used whenever the stress of work became too much. It had worn off hours ago, and he could feel the familiar ache returning, making further intimacy impossible. He settled for a few more minutes of half-hearted kisses before retreating to the balcony for a cigarette, leaving Phoenix alone with her restless thoughts. She tossed and turned, the silk sheets tangled around her legs, but sleep wouldn't come. Images from the night before, of Drake's touch, his eager kisses, flashed through her mind, making her body ache in a way Ethan never could. Across town, Drake was having similar thoughts. He couldn't stop thinking about Phoenix, the memory of their night together playing on a loop in his mind. The way she had looked at him, the feel of her body pressed against his. He wanted nothing more than to race back to her, to lose himself in her again. But the memory of Ethan's car in the driveway held him back. He was terrified of what Ethan would do if he ever found out. And he couldn't risk his mother losing her job. He was playing a dangerous game, one he wasn't sure he could win. The next morning, Drake went to wait for his mother outside the Hawthorne residence. As he always did, he wandered around aimlessly, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of Phoenix and his impending departure for university. Soon, he'd be leaving for New York, leaving behind everything familiar for a new life in the city. It was an exciting prospect, but the weight of his family's financial situation pressed down on him. Would his mother be able to manage sending him money while supporting herself? He knew he would find a part-time job in New York to help ease the burden. But there was no guarantee he'd find work right away. Lost in thought, he didn't notice the sleek car pulling up to the curb until the driver's door opened. Drake's heart leapt into his throat. It was Ethan. He froze, a wave of panic washing over him. Ethan's eyes met his, and Drake felt a jolt of fear. Has Ethan seen him here before? Did he know? Hey there. Ethan greeted him casually. You're Mrs. Willow's son, right? Drake swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Yeah, that's me, Drake. Nice to meet you, Drake. Ethan said. They chatted briefly, Ethan's demeanor surprisingly normal, though Drake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Ethan's gaze lingered for a moment too long, his eyes holding a strange, unreadable expression. Drake watched as Ethan climbed back into his car. A fleeting glimpse of a video playing on his phone, a woman's tear-streaked face. An angry voice muffled by the distance. But then Ethan was gone. leaving Drake standing on the sidewalk. His heart still racing, he exhaled slowly, a wave of relief washing over him. That was too close, he thought to himself. That night, when he returned for his mother, Phoenix was waiting. She wore a dress that clung to her curves. Her lips painted a seductive red. As soon as Mrs. Willow was out of sight, they were at each other, their bodies a tangled mess of need and desperation. The memory of Ethan's strange behavior that morning was pushed to the back of Drake's mind, replaced by the intoxicating scent of Phoenix's perfume and the feel of her skin against his. He lost himself in her, the familiar thrill of their stolen encounters erasing any lingering doubts. The guilt that had plagued him, the fear of getting caught, all of it evaporated under Phoenix's touch. He was hers, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Phoenix, too, was caught in the throes of their forbidden affair. Ethan was a distant memory, a shadow that no longer touched her. She craved Drake's touch, his youthful energy, the way he made her feel things she hadn't felt in years. They grew bolder, their encounters more frequent, their passion more intense. Ethan, preoccupied with work and increasingly reliant on his sleep aids, was none the wiser. He came and went, a ghost in his own home, while Phoenix found solace in the arms of a younger man. "You okay?" Ethan winced, pressing a hand to his cheek. I'm fine. You were great, by the way, totally believable." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a wad of cash, tossing it to the woman who was scrambling back into her clothes. "Here's your payment. Probably best if you head to the clinic." "Yeah? That's quite a scratch I gave you." "Thanks." The woman mumbled, her cheeks still flushed. "You too. You might need a few stitches yourself. Wouldn't want to ruin that handsome face of yours." Ethan attempted a smile. "Don't worry about me. You should probably get going." Sure. Well, it was fun working with you. Call me if you ever need anything else. I'm always available for special projects." She winked, then slipped out of the office, leaving Ethan alone with the echo of her laughter and the sharp scent of her perfume. He leaned back in his chair, blood still seeping through his fingers, his mind replaying the scene that had just unfolded. It had all happened so fast. He had planned this, orchestrated it down to the last detail. But a part of him felt lost, like he had just sacrificed something precious, something irreplaceable. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just closed the door on something important, something he might spend the rest of his life searching for. The guilt settled over him like a shroud. Ms. Miller rushed in, her face pale with concern, pressing a clean towel into his hand. "Mr. Hawthorne, oh my God, what happened? Here, let me get that for you." She fussed over him, leading him to the bathroom to clean the wound. But as he looked at his reflection, he could see the truth in his eyes. He wasn't the one who should be feeling guilty. Phoenix was. What he had done, this elaborate charade, this painful betrayal, it was all for her. He had given her the key to unlock the cage that their marriage had become, to set them both free. Ethan had known about Phoenix and Drake from the very beginning. He had seen the way they looked at each other, the lingering touches, the stolen glances. He had saved every security camera recording that Phoenix had tried to erase. His heart breaking a little more with each viewing. He had started staying away more often. Longer business trips, late nights at the office, testing the limits of their relationship, gauging the depth of her infidelity. He had watched from a distance as Drake filled the spaces he had left empty. A constant reminder of what he had lost. He knew he could confront her, lay out the evidence of her betrayal. But what good would that do? To make her feel guilty? To force her to stay in a loveless marriage? No, Ethan loved her too much for that. His love for her ran deeper than her infidelity, deeper than the pain she had caused him. He loved her enough to let her go, to give her the chance at happiness, even if it was with someone else. Staging this elaborate scene with Violet, the woman from Oak Avenue, had cost him a small fortune, but it was a small price to pay for Phoenix's freedom. This way, she could walk away with her head held high, free from judgment, free from the burden of their crumbling marriage. And so, Phoenix went to her family, her voice shaking with righteous anger as she told them about Ethan's infidelity. They rallied around her, offering comfort and support, their condemnation of Ethan swift and absolute. No one deserved to be treated this way. least of all someone as beautiful and vibrant as Phoenix. Divorce was the only option, the only way to salvage her dignity and move on with her life. 3 months later, they stood before the judge. Two strangers who had once vowed to spend their lives together. Ethan, his face marred by a thin, white scar where the crystal had cut him, accepted full responsibility for the affair. The divorce was finalized quickly. The judge siding with Phoenix. She would keep the Hawthorne residence, a hefty settlement in her bank account, and the satisfaction of having won. Outside the courthouse, Drake was waiting. He wrapped Phoenix in his arms, his eyes filled with adoration, his love for her a tangible thing. Ethan watched them from afar, his heart aching, his stomach churning with a mixture of loss and relief. He glanced down at his phone. At the video paused on the screen, a younger, carefree Drake scaling the wall of the Hawthorne residence, his face illuminated by the moonlight, a hungry look in his eyes. Ethan closed his eyes, swallowing the bitter taste in his throat, willing away the tears that threatened to spill. It was done. He had set her free. Now, he had to find a way to set himself free too. He had a family to think about, parents who needed him, a career to rebuild. He couldn't let this break him. He wouldn't. One day, months after the divorce, Phoenix spotted a familiar figure standing on the side of Oak Avenue. It was Violet, the woman from Ethan's office. A wave of shock, then anger, surged through her, and she slammed on the brakes. Pulling over to the curb, Violet recognized her, a flicker of apprehension crossing her features. But before Phoenix could unleash her fury, Violet held up a hand, her expression surprisingly calm. "He paid me to do it, you know." Her voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of malice. "The whole thing, the fight, the tears, everything. He even gave me this scar." She pointed to a small mark just below her eye, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. "Said he needed to make it convincing." Phoenix listened in stunned silence as Violet explained how Ethan had sought her out. How he had meticulously planned the entire scene. He had paid her handsomely to play the role of the other woman. To give Phoenix the ammunition she needed to walk away from their marriage. "He said he loved you too much to make you stay." Violet finished quietly. Phoenix felt a lump rise in her throat, her carefully constructed anger crumbling into dust. She had been so blinded by her own hurt, her own sense of betrayal, that she had failed to see the truth. Ethan's actions, the staged affair, the carefully orchestrated lies, it had all been for her. A wave of shame washed over her. She had sought solace in the arms of another man, had broken her vows without a second thought. And yet, Ethan had protected her, had shielded her from the consequences of her own actions. She drove to Ethan's childhood home, the guilt gnawing at her like a parasite. He had given up his career, his dreams, to care for his aging parents. She found him in the backyard, his laughter blending with the joyful squeals of 2 children. He had adopted 2 young orphans, giving them a home, a family, a future. They clung to him like little monkeys, their faces bright with adoration. It was the life they had always dreamed of, the life they could have had. Phoenix stood there for a long time, watching them, tears streaming down her face. She had been selfish, foolish, blinded by her own desires. She didn't deserve Ethan's forgiveness, didn't deserve his love. She had traded a priceless treasure for a handful of fleeting moments. A love built on lust and deceit. Drake was gone, off at university, already building a new life for himself. A life that no longer included her. The money, the house, it all felt meaningless now. A poor substitute for the love she had thrown away. She had been so focused on what she wanted, what she thought she deserved, that she had failed to cherish the one person who had truly loved her. Flaws and all, the realization struck her like a physical blow. Ethan had been right, some affairs are for love. And hers had been the price of her freedom. As she walked away, the sound of Ethan's laughter echoing in her ears, she knew she would carry the weight of her choices for the rest of her life. Thank you for joining us for this emotional journey. As we've seen, Phoenix's pursuit of passion and freedom came at a heavy cost, one that left her with deep regrets. Meanwhile, Ethan's love ran deeper than she ever realized, willing to sacrifice his own happiness for her peace. In the end, their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes, the things we chase aren't worth what we leave behind. If you enjoyed this story, Be sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more captivating tales.